Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're enjoying our second week here of Foundations of Business Strategy. Joining you here from Charlottesville. We're having a rainy afternoon. I hope you have better weather where you are at. I'm excited to say that the people continue to sign up for the course. We have over 91,000 people signed up. Lots of participation, 300,000 video views, 114,000 posts viewed at this point. And once again, I've been really pleased and enjoyed reading through the posts and seeing the rich conversations taking place in the forums. Now, as I said last week, let me just give you, once again, a review of what the purpose of these weekly debriefs are. The purpose is to discuss the cases and the tools, but my intent, again, is not to tell you the answers to the questions raised, rather to help you illustrate and think through the questions. As we discussed last week, there's frequently not a right or wrong answer to the questions that are asked, but there's certainly better argued answers or better argued responses than others. So this is an opportunity in these cases to apply the tools in your toolkit and to hone your strategic analysis capability. Now, before I jump into the case questions about Red Hook today, let me address a couple logistical issues. First, I wanted to let you know that I've created a sub-forum in the general discussion forum called Questions for a Professor. What I'd like you to do is, if you have a specific question for me that you would like me to respond to during the weekly debrief, please post it there, and I will respond to the ones that are voted up by you all as the most popular ones and ones you'd like to see me respond to. So this will be a way for me to pick out really where some of the pressing questions that you have that I can respond to. Second, about the project, there still seems to be a lot of questions about what is expected and what is the final deliverable on the project. First, I recommend that if you haven't done so yet, that you pick an organization that you wish to analyze. Again, I recommend you begin working on those projects right away and give yourself the time as the course unfolds to complete those projects. Once again, you'll have a week after the end of week 6 to submit that final project. In particular, the due date is at 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, April 14th. If you're looking for organization to analyze, I encourage you once again to go to the discussion forums in the final project subforum and the subforum titled Organization Seeking Analyses. Once again, I've invited companies and nonprofits and the like to solicit whether if you would like to do an analysis of them. And there's a number of opportunities posted in that folder if you're looking for a project to complete. If you're looking to submit your final exam, once again, towards the end of the course, there's a number of questions about this. Very simply, if you go to the Final Project tab on the course website, you will see at the bottom of that page a link to submitting your analyses. It's pretty straightforward once you get to that link at the bottom of the Final Project tab. Number of questions about the type of file to submit. You're welcome to prepare it in either Word or PowerPoint, whatever you're most comfortable with. I have a preference for Word, but once again, PowerPoint is fine. However, I'd ask that you convert it to a PDF file before submitting it through the Coursera platform. Experience suggests that that will be an easier way to have it posted and will be more easily able to be read by everyone else, or at least those who are doing their evaluations of your report. Which brings up this idea of peer assessment. Once again, we have 91,000 people registered for this course. It usually takes me a couple days to grade 60 of these reports. So you can imagine there's no way for me personally to grade your reports as much as I would like to look through them all. So we're using the peer assessment function in Coursera. So you are asked and actually required, if you want to receive the certificate of accomplishment, to do a peer assessment of 5 other analyses that are posted there. There's a grading rubric associated with that. I can talk about that more as we progress through the term. But the idea, again, is you submit your own analysis, then 5 other people will assess it, give you a grade, and then your final grade is the average of those 5 assessments. And that you, too, are required to be able to get a certificate of accomplishment to submit a peer evaluations of 5 others as well. And in that way, we're able to collectively grade these assignments. Some real nitty-gritty here. This is all in the Final Project tab. There's a 1,500-word executive summary. This is kind of a memo format here, but there is an unlimited number of exhibits that you can post there. So 1,500-word limit on the executive summary, and then an unlimited number of exhibits. I do suggest that you refer to those exhibits in your executive summary and recognize that Exhibits can be very adding to your analysis, make it much more robust, but too many analyses, or too many exhibits, they begin to get ignored. So use your judgment on a nice balance of how many exhibits you need to communicate the central points of your analysis. A number of people have requested that I post an example, an exemplar analysis. I'm usually hesitant to do that because it often becomes just an automatic template people use for doing their final projects. I would suggest and point out there are more than one way in which you can approach this final project. However, I feel given the circumstances, I will post an example report. Recognize the example report that I'm going to post is not exactly the assignment I've given you in the sense of they weren't required to give a recommendation. So in this analysis I will post, it will have an analysis, but it won't have that final recommendation piece. I just want you to recognize that. I'll have that up and running within the next day or so. All right, so once again, if you have any more questions on the peer assessment or the final project, once again, send the questions into the forums and we'll try to address those. All right, let's jump into the case analysis here. This is one of my favorite cases to discuss. The craft beer segment is a really fascinating industry from a competitive standpoint here. We begin with asking this question of a competitor analysis that we had asked last week. And in particular, how would you define Red Hook's industry? And just as we had the challenge with Google, even though this seems pretty well specified, there still was some debate. Right? Do we analyze just the craft segment? Do we add in the mass-produced beer segment? Do we extend it to all alcoholic beverages? Or is it better to think about maybe all beverages and a defined alcoholic or non-alcoholic here? What I suggest is what I suggested last week. Think about strategic groups. Think about concentric groups. Clearly the most relevant competitors, the ones directly competing with Red Hook, are other craft beer manufacturers. But as many of you pointed out, mass-produced beer manufacturers are beginning to enter into this space and competing directly with the craft beers, not to mention that they're also highly substitutable between one another. And then you can think about alcoholic beverages and beverages in general as other groups you might want to keep your eye on, but perhaps not spend quite as much time analyzing. There's a nice post by Rachel that a number of you had voted up where she does a nice job balancing between this analysis of the craft segment and the mass-produced segment. Now, one of the important things you hopefully realize as you begin to analyze these two segments is the relative size difference between those. So let me share with you here just a real basic competitor analysis that I put together here. Once again, this is pretty simple stuff, but it does illustrate some of the main data here. So let me see if I can get it forward for you here. All right, let's see if we can screen share it. All right, so you see the competitor analysis here. What's showing right now is actually the mass-produced side of the market. You see 50 billion in sales, 77% of the market here represented by these three big players, Anheuser-Busch, Miller, who was owned by Philip Morris at the time of the case, and Coors. And you see the relative market shares here. And then we have these other traditional brewers who have smaller shares, smaller sales. One observation here, this is a highly concentrated industry. Three big players here command 77% of the market for beer in the US. Now, let's compare that to the craft segment. So the craft segment, there's about 3 billion in sales, 30 to 70% growth, so a high growth segment, but at the point in time of the case, at least in 1994, only 1.4% of the market. The market leader by far and away is Boston Beer Company, maker of Sam Adams, but Red Hook is also one of the top three producers as well. But once again, the relative scale of craft versus mass, at least at the time of the case, very, very different. And at least that would be one of the things you would be hoping to get out of your competitor analysis. All right, let's move on now to our environmental analysis. Once again, I was very pleased to see the discussion forums. A number of you posted really great comprehensive analyses of different environmental trends that are impacting this industry. Obviously, one of the key things, again, is to notice some of the differences in these trends for craft versus mass beer. A lot of things suggesting that growth in demand for mass-produced beer was relatively flat in the U.S. during this time period. A number of things driving that: political, legal issues about raising of the drinking age, concerns about drunk driving, all of that suppressing demand for alcohol. Yet for craft beer, there was a number of positive factors leading to its growth. As Gerald observed, craft brew drinkers were highly educated. Hayda followed that up by observing the economy of the U.S. was growing at that time, which meant increasing incomes and more affluent population, which would further provide boost to demand of craft beer. Now, others, though, were a little more circumspect. Keenan had a nice observation, which is, this might just be a small market niche at the end of the day, though, given this target demographic of highly educated, more wealthier participants and consumers there. Let me share with you a quick environmental analysis that I put together. Once again, this is rather rudimentary here, but it just gives some illustration here that might be useful for you. So here we see the idea of environmental analysis, some of the demographic trends again. And I think like the big takeaway I would have again is these relative differences in demand, that we see growing demand for craft, static or if not declining demand for the mass-produced segment. So all of this suggests at this point at least that, hey, there's something to be said about the craft segment. But as we are discussing this week, really need to think about industry structure as well. Industry structure is critical here for our understanding of whether a market is an attractive market or not. So let's turn now to your 5 forces analysis. As many of you observed first, the craft beer segment is really not that hard to enter in. Though there was still some confusion about this. People would say, well, if I'm an entrepreneur, that's a good thing, I can get into that business. And that logic makes sense to one level. But recall, the easier it is to get into an industry, the less attractive that industry is, because the more that people can get into it, the more competitive it's going to be, the harder it's going to be to either differentiate yourself or get pricing pressure or pricing up so as to be able to get those margins you may be looking at. I think Jamie Lee in her comments nails it. I want to agree with you that craft beer market is more attractive, but I'm not sure if the evidence points conclusively to that. The mass market beer doesn't look too bad. Low threat of entry, low bargaining power suppliers, low threat of substitution, low intensity of rivalry. All of these are factors which are make a market more attractive. The best thing the craft beer has going for it is that it is growing. And I think that's exactly right. We see, once again, a growing craft beer segment, but a lot of things that seem to be working against it. So once again, let me share with you a rudimentary 5 forces analysis here. Pull that up. Here we go. And I apologize for the small type here. But once again, many of you made these points on the online forums here. Again, craft beers are relatively easy to enter here. Their minimum efficient scale, MES, is low, meaning you don't need to have that much production to be able to be cost competitive in the industry. Low capital, especially with the utilization of contract brewing like Sam Adams does. We think about substitutes. One could argue at least that liquor and other types of alcoholic beverages are more likely a substitute in craft versus mass. Supplier power up and down the chain. Little supplier power for the craft beers. They're tending to buy these products kind of off the shelf in competitive markets. And then this question about buyer power, really interesting question you might ask about differentiation. Are craft beers truly differentiated? And what I always ask students, those who are these beer drinkers, is have you ever gone and bought a craft beer specifically because you've never had it before? That's the opposite of brand loyalty, right? That's the opposite of this willingness to pay that we're always interested in here. What it actually suggests is that people are not very brand loyal. They're willing to try new brands. They're willing to switch between different products. That all gives more bargaining power to the buyers here. So while in fact it is very much the case that craft beers tend to sell at a higher price than mass-produced beers, it might actually be the case there's less differentiation amongst craft than there are compared to mass. If we turn to the mass-produced beers in the bottom right-hand quadrant here, what we see is we've got potentially huge barriers to entry in terms of economies of scale. There are things like advertising expenses that the big producers have to play in. We have large sunk costs in the building of these factories. Again, large minimum efficient scale that's necessary. Significant bargaining power over suppliers and arguably buyers, especially through the distribution networks, when you have 3 big players and thousands of different distributors there. All of this tends to lessen rivalry. And there's a tendency often to think about high rivalry when we have these duopoly situations where you might have Miller versus Coors or Miller versus Anheuser-Busch, I always give the example of Coke and Pepsi. While it seems that way, think about adding one more competitor to that market. Adding that one more competitor just makes it more competitive. So Coke and Pepsi, yes, it seems like they're fighting tooth and nail, but they're actually both very profitable companies. If you have thousands of rivals like you do in the craft segment, that often makes it a very tough industry to compete in. All right, so now let's turn now to the final question, which was, would you invest? What are the future prospects for Red Hook beer? Now, once again, there was some nice discussion and disagreement on the discussion boards there. Some believe that Red Hook will be able to rise above the rest and capture what looks like a growing and attractive craft segment. But as Manoj points out, I think the threat of rivalry is really strong. The reason being there are already quite a few companies playing in the specialty brew market. And that's the real rub of the question here with the craft beer segment. Highly competitive industries, lots of different players, constant new entry of those players there. At the heart of this question of whether Red Hook can succeed is really a question about capabilities. Do they have the capabilities to outrun and outcompete the other players in this craft segment? And this is a question we're going to attack next week with our capability analysis and really start to unpack this idea of how a firm has competitive advantage in a market. Now, one of the advantages of a case like this is that it's actually set back in 1994, and we can actually look at what happened from 1994 into the present day. So the first thing I would observe is they had a very successful IPO. First day close of $27, market cap north of $200 million. However, over the next 48 months, Red Hook's market cap goes from $219 million to $65 million over that time period. And the pain was not limited to Red Hook. Pete's Wicked Ale market cap goes from $259 million to $59 million over that same period. They were acquired by the Gambrinus brothers in 1998 for less than $54 million, after once again having a capitalization of $259 million. Boston Beer Company goes from $620 million to $125 million in market cap. Their stock price goes from greater than $32 down to $6.50 by August of 1998. What basically occurred in the craft beer segment in the late 1990s was a major shakeout. There were so many craft beers on the market. One of the huge challenges was just literally getting your product for distribution, for sales in retail establishments like grocery stores and the like. There's limited selection, limited shelf space, yet there were literally thousands of producers, leading to what was a brutal shakeout. Now, if you look to today, Red Hook struggled for a long time. They flirted with bankruptcy. They actually merged with Whittemere Brothers in 2008 to form what's called the Craft Beer Alliance. Their current market cap is 141, so once again, almost half of what it was at its height back in 1995. And this again is these many years later. Let me show you some stock price graphs here just to kind of hit this point home here. So one second here, we're going to see in the black, what you're seeing is a Sam Adams, maker or Boston Beer Company, maker of Sam Adams. In the blue, we see Red Hook, and in the yellowish orange, we have the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Now, first observation is Red Hook has been a terrible investment. If you look back to when they IPO'd and what their return on today is a negative return, quite substantial one. If we look at Sam Adams, interestingly enough, they have had quite a significant return in about the last year or so. But historically, especially if you looked at, like, let's say where I'm pointing here in 2006 or so, you effectively had a 0% return over that entire decade after their IPO. So not a great investment compared to something like the Dow Jones Industrial Average, though they've seemed to have a lot of success in the last year or so. So let's dig a little bit deeper into what they have going on here. So here you see revenues, and this is really interesting. We forecasted growth for the craft beer segment. And in fact, if you look at Sam Adams' growth over his 10-year period, they had a cumulative average return of 5% here. So that's the 5% here. But if you look at the other line here, the darker blue one, this is for Budweiser, Anheuser-Busch, they had about a similar 5% return. And oh, by the way, these are on very different scales here. So the left scale is for Budweiser, who went from about 11 billion up to 16 billion in sales. Sam Adams and Boston Beer went from about here on the right axis, little south of 200 million to about, let's see here, about quite 300 million during that time period. So even with the differences in scale and size, their growth rates were about the same. And in fact, craft beer in the U.S. has never really gotten much above 5% of the entire marketplace there. So truly, 1994, growth prospects, and they recognize and realize those growth prospects, but it still wasn't sufficient to supplant the mass-produced side of the market. The real story comes down to the next graph. What you see here are net profit margins here, right? So this is profits over revenues here. The lighter blue again is Sam Adams. What you see is they've basically been around 5% net profit margin over that 10-year period. Now you look at Anheuser-Busch, they're roughly 12, even up to like 15% net profit margin over that time period. Anheuser-Busch, the mass-produced beer manufacturers, they're not a sexy investment, yet at the end of the day, they produce very nice returns year in, year out, actually have nice dividend policies, and are actually an attractive investment if you think of it on those terms. Sam Adams, the most successful of the craft beers, 5% margins, a much more competitive marketplace, and again, characterized by this rich turnover of new firms constantly entering in, replacing old firms in that industry. It's not to say you can't make money in craft beer, but it's a much more competitive market than what you see in the mass-produced market. Now, again, it'd be nice to be a mass producer, but it's hard, right? And so establishing that position is critical. And in 2 weeks, we're going to talk a lot about this notion of competitive dynamics and how one establishes a valuable position. So you could be an Anheuser-Busch or Miller or Coors. So let me end here by just sharing with you again this idea of industry structure, right? It is very, very important for us to recognize that at the end of the day, demand is important, and we want to consider that in the future prospects of an industry. But we also have to give critical understanding to the underlying industry structure and how that may or may not create barriers to industry. One of my favorite investors, business people, is Warren Buffett, and he has this great quote that I think really epitomizes what this week has been all about. So let me share that with you here. So Buffett says, when an industry with a reputation for difficult economics meets a manager with a reputation for excellence, it is usually the industry that keeps its reputation intact. I think that says it very well again. Craft beer manufacturing, by its very nature, when we analyze the industry structure, is a very difficult business to compete in. Once again, it's not that you can't make money, but it's going to be more difficult than in the comparison, in this case, to the mass-produced segment. All right. Let me end here by once again encouraging you to keep up with the material. I'm really pleased to see where people are going here. We'll be releasing the third week of materials on Sunday evening. Please keep participating in the forums. As I indicated by email, begin thinking about the final project, and we'll keep on pushing forward here, and I hope you're enjoying the course. Thank you very much, and enjoy the next week. Take care.